Be me, tenured associate professor of sociology at State University, late 30s, published author, respected in my field. I spent 15 years building my academic career on understanding power structures and social inequalities. Tonight is the annual Campus Open Forum on contemporary social issues. Administration randomly pairs faculty with community participants for civil discourse. Get my assignment. Debate topic is evidence-based approaches to understanding gender outcomes in modern society. My opponent is some high school kid, literally 17 years old. An administration tells me he specifically requested this topic and asked to be paired with a faculty member. Probably some debate club try-hard padding his college applications. This will be easy, maybe even fun. I can use this as a teaching moment for the students in attendance. Show them how to dismantle uninformed opinion with academic rigor. Spend maybe 30 minutes reviewing my usual talking points. Have given versions of this lecture dozens of times. Know the arguments inside and out. Patriarchy, socialization, structural barriers, implicit bias. The framework is solid, built on decades of scholarship. Don't even bother looking up who this kid is. Why would I? Arrive at the auditorium an hour early. Already over 200 students filling the seats. Apparently, this is one of the better attended forums in years. Colleague mentions the kid has some kind of following on social media. Probably posts video game, commentary, or something equally vapid. Whatever. Social media clout means nothing in academic discourse. See him arrive 15 minutes before start time. Average-looking teenager, carrying a leather folder and a water bottle. No visible nervousness, which surprises me slightly. Most high schoolers would be intimidated. Moderator goes over the rules. Opening statements, then alternating responses on specific subtopics, then audience questions. Topics will be drawn randomly from approved list. Each speaker gets access to one laptop for reference materials. I brought my citations folder, though I barely need it. I can recite most of my key studies from memory. Forum begins, audience settles. I go first with opening statement. Deliver my standard introduction about how gender disparities stem from historical oppression and ongoing structural barriers. Mention wage gap, representation in leadership, disproportionate domestic labor burden. Cite the familiar statistics. Women earn 79 cents on the dollar, hold only 25% of executive positions, perform twice as much unpaid household labor. Speak with the confidence of someone who has delivered this lecture to thousands of students. Audience seems engaged, taking notes. Kid's turn for opening statement. He thanks the moderator, thanks me for participating, speaks without notes, says he looks forward to examining the evidence together. Together, like we are colleagues. Like he is my peer. Already irritating. His opening statement is careful, measured. Says that gender outcomes are complex and multifactorial. Claims that many popular narratives oversimplify the data. States his position, that biological factors, personal choices, and economic incentives explain most observed differences. Says that misrepresenting data to support ideological conclusions does harm to both men and women. I almost laugh. Biological factors, the oldest anti-feminist canard in the book. This will be easier than I thought. First topic drawn, economics of gender, wage differences. My strongest area, I present the standard analysis. Explain that women face discrimination in hiring, promotion, and compensation. Mention studies showing identical resumes with female names get fewer callbacks. Discuss glass ceiling, old boys clubs, hostile work environments. Cite the aggregate wage gap figure. Explain that even controlling for occupation, women earn less. Sit back, satisfied. Kid asks if he can respond with specific questions about my claims. Moderator allows it. He pulls up a document on his laptop, starts citing studies I have never heard of. References a 2019 longitudinal study from Cornell, tracking actual wage progression. Claims it shows that when controlling for hours worked, continuous years in workforce, and specific position rather than broad occupational category, wage gaps shrink to between 2 and 7%. states that this remaining gap could be explained by factors like negotiation patterns and risk-taking in job selection. Mentions a Harvard study of Boston public transport workers. Same union, same wages, same jobs. Says male drivers earned more because they volunteered for overtime and longer routes at higher rates. Cites specific numbers. Male workers took 48% fewer unpaid hours off. I try to interrupt, say he is cherry-picking. He continues calmly. Brings up the resume study I mentioned. Says he read the full methodology. Points out that callback differential was present, but hiring rates after interview showed no significant gender effect. Suggests this indicates resume screening bias, but not final hiring discrimination. Then pivots to my claim about women earning less in same occupations. Pulls up Bureau of Labor Statistics methodology. Explains that same occupation includes massive categorical breadth. Says physician category includes dermatologists working 30 hours weekly and trauma surgeons working 80. Claims aggregating these obscures individual choice patterns. Cites medical residency selection data showing women select lower paid specialties at higher rates, even when controlling for competitiveness of residency. References a study of pediatrics versus orthopedic surgery compensation and gender distribution. I feel first twinge of concern. Where is this teenager getting this information? Try to respond by discussing structural factors that push women toward lower paying specialties. Mention work-life balance, needs due to disproportionate family responsibilities. He nods politely. Says, we will discuss family labor distribution in next section. Says, for now, the question is whether wage gaps in economics reflect discrimination or other factors. Asks me directly, if discrimination is primary cause, why do young childless urban women out-earn male counterparts in same demographic? Cites specific cities, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, among women aged 22 to 30. I did not know this statistic. Stammer that this is a narrow demographic. He agrees. Says it is narrow. Says it is also the demographic that most closely controls for the factors I attributed to structural sexism. Same education, same age, same career stage, no child-rearing differentiation yet. Suggests this indicates that in absence of confounding factors, discrimination may not be primary driver. Audience is dead silent. Everyone writing frantically. Moderator calls time. Moves to next topic. Topic is biological factors. In gender differences. My stomach drops slightly. This is always contentious. I present the standard, social, constructionist position. Explain that observed differences between men and women are primarily result of socialization. Girls taught to be nurturing, boys taught to be aggressive. Cite studies on gendered toy preferences emerging from parental influence. Discuss how stereotype threat affects performance. Mention that brain plasticity research shows male and female brains are largely similar. Emphasize that biological essentialism has been used to justify oppression. Kid waits for his turn. Starts by agreeing that socialization exists and matters, then systematically presents evidence I cannot dismiss. Cites David Reimer case, which I know and hate. Boy, raised as girl after botched circumcision, never identified as female, despite intensive socialization, eventually transitioned back, and later died by suicide. Mentions this contradicts strong social construction hypothesis. I argue this is one case, not data. He nods, moves on. Presents cross-cultural meta-analysis of temperament differences in infants under 1 year. Claims activity level, interest in faces versus objects, and frustration response show sex differences across all cultures studied. References specific study. Connellan infant eye tracking research showing day-old infants display gender-typical interest patterns. Discusses how gender egalitarian countries show larger personality differences between men and women, not smaller. Cites Global Gender Gap Index, correlation with Big Five, personality trait differentiation. Says this is opposite of what pure socialization model predicts. If socialization caused differences, more egalitarian countries should show less differentiation. Instead, they show more. Calls this a paradox for social construction theory. Brings up occupational preferences in primates. References studies of vervet monkeys, showing male juveniles prefer trucks and female juveniles. Prefer dolls without any human socialization. Cites replication studies in rhesus macaques. I try to argue that applying animal behavior to humans is reductive. He agrees it would be reductive to claim animals and humans are identical. Asks whether it is reasonable to assume that sex hormones affecting behavior in all other mammals somehow have zero effect in humans, and frames it as a question of parsimony. Points out that denying any biological contribution requires assuming humans are unique exception to mammalian patterns. Asks what evidence supports that assumption. I cannot provide a specific study. Deflect by discussing neuroplasticity. He acknowledges neuroplasticity, then cites digit ratio studies, CAS studies in girls with androgen exposure, testosterone correlation studies with spatial reasoning, mentions that within-sex variation is larger than between-sex variation for most traits, says this means individuals cannot be judged by category, but that average differences are still real and have explanatory relevance for population-level patterns. So, uses height analogy. Men are taller, on average, but many individual women are taller than many individual men. Says denying average difference would be absurd, but so would discriminating against individuals based on group averages. Audience seems to find this reasonable. I am starting to sweat. How does a 17-year-old know this literature better than I do? Moderator moves to next section. Family and household labor. I recover some confidence here. Present data on second shift, emotional labor, mental load. Discuss how women perform majority of childcare and housework even when working full-time. Cite time diary studies showing this pattern. Mention that this unpaid labor subsidizes men's careers. Kid acknowledges the data on time spent. Then asks about methodology of what counts as labor. Pulls up the actual time diary study I cited. Points out that male typical tasks like home maintenance, car repair, and yard work are often excluded from household labor calculations. Shows that when these are included, gap narrows substantially. References studies showing men work more total paid hours when employed. Mentions that in households where women out-earn men, labor distribution shifts accordingly. Cites Pew Research data on this. Discusses college enrollment demographics. Points out that women now earn nearly 60% of bachelor degrees. Asks whether this creates advantage in future earning potential. Mentions that in couples where both work full-time, time allocation differences are much smaller. Suggests that aggregate data is heavily influenced by couples choosing specialized arrangements. References survey data showing most couples report satisfaction with their labor division, brings up revealed preference versus stated oppression. Asks how we distinguish between imposed burden and negotiated household arrangement. I argue that women's choices are constrained by socialization and expectations. He asks whether I believe women lack agency to make authentic choices. Points out that this position requires assuming women are perpetually unable to know their own preferences. Frames this as potentially more demeaning than acknowledging authentic preference differences. I feel trapped by the framing. If I say women cannot know their real preferences, I sound paternalistic. If I say they can, his point stands. Try to move discussion to workplace discrimination and representation. Moderator allows brief topic expansion. I discuss underrepresentation of women in leadership and STEM fields, attribute this to bias, harassment, and lack of support. Kid asks about educational pipeline. Points out that bias hypothesis predicts women would be discouraged from STEM early. Presents data showing girls match or exceed boys in math performance through high school. Notes that women earn majority of biology degrees. Asks why bias would affect physics and engineering, but not biology and chemistry at undergraduate level. Suggests interest differences might play a role. Cites international studies of student preferences in countries with different gender equality levels. References that same paradox from earlier. Most gender-equal countries have lowest rates of women in STEM. Less gender-equal countries have more women in STEM. Explains this as economic necessity, driving choices in poorer countries, while wealthy egalitarian countries allow people to follow preferences more freely. Mentions that within sex variation in interests predicts STEM participation better than any bias measure. Brings up Google internal data on interest patterns among current employees. I argue that interest differences are themselves result of socialization. He asks if I have evidence that early childhood intervention changes these patterns. Mentions studies of gender-neutral toy exposure showing minimal long-term effects. Cites Swedish preschool program results. I do not know. These studies feel increasingly defensive. Next topic drawn. Perspectives on consent and relationship dynamics. Finally, something where I can regain ground. Discuss affirmative consent, enthusiastic consent standards. Talk about power differentials and coercion. Explain concept of structurally problematic relationships. Kid mostly agrees with basic consent principles. Then brings up application concerns. Discusses cases of expanded definitions leading to problematic enforcement. Mentions cases where regretted consensual encounters were retroactively classified as violations. Cites specific university tribunal cases, details I cannot verify in the moment. Talks about evidentiary standards and burden of proof. Discusses disparate treatment in university judicial processes. Mentions studies showing gender disparity in disciplinary outcomes for similar violations. Brings up data on false accusation rates from multiple studies with different methodologies. Acknowledges these are minority of cases, but argues they matter for policy design. Discusses impact on accused individuals, including cases later overturned. I argue that we must believe women and that false accusations are extremely rare. He cites competing statistics from FBI, academic studies, meta-analyses, shows that estimates range from 2% to 10% depending on definition and methodology. Asks what rate I would consider acceptable for policy that presumes guilt. Points out that even 2% of serious accusations means real harm to innocent people. Frames this as question of balanced justice rather than dismissing victims. I try to argue that err on side of believing victims is necessary given historical dismissal. He agrees historical dismissal was wrong. Asks whether correcting past injustice requires creating present injustice in opposite direction, poses it as a moral philosophy question. Quotes Blackstone's ratio about preferring guilty go free over innocent punished. Audience clearly engaged with this framing. I feel my authority slipping. This is not how this was supposed to go. Moderator announces we are moving to audience questions section. First question is about gender differences in criminal sentencing. Directed at me. I acknowledge that men receive harsher sentences. Try to frame this as a result of patriarchal expectations of male violence. Kid jumps in. Agrees. This is example of gender-based discrimination. Asks why this is not treated as major men's issue by feminist organizations. Points out that sentencing gap is larger than racial gap that receives much more attention. Asks whether I support addressing this disparity as gender equality issue. I stumble, say, it is complicated by broader context. He presses. Asks if disparity benefiting women is complicated, but disparity benefiting men is simple discrimination. Audience laughs. Not with me. Next question about domestic violence. Student asks about male victims. I present standard position about majority of severe violence being male perpetrated. Kid acknowledges that men commit majority of severe intimate partner violence. Then presents CDC data on reciprocal versus non-reciprocal violence. Claims that in non-reciprocal violence, women are perpetrators slightly more often. Discusses how surveys asking about victimization show more gender symmetry than arrest records. Suggests reporting bias and law enforcement response bias. Mentions Duluth model and primary aggressor policies. Explains these were designed assuming male perpetration. Discusses cases of male victims arrested when calling police. Cites specific statistics on arrest rates when men report victimization. I argue that women's violence is typically defensive. He asks if I have data supporting that claim. I do not. He presents study data showing initiation patterns. Discusses severity versus frequency distinction. Acknowledges men do more physical damage on average. Asks whether severity is only metric that matters for violence prevention. 1. Frames question in terms of public health approach. I am losing track of my prepared responses. Never expected to have to defend basic positions. Assumed my credentials and experience would carry the debate. This child has clearly spent hundreds of hours preparing. Next question is about education outcomes for boys. Student mentions boys falling behind in reading, graduation rates, college enrollment, asks what interventions I support. I mention toxic masculinity and need for boys to engage differently with education. Kid presents international literacy data, shows that boy-girl reading gap exists across all countries tested. Asks whether toxic masculinity exists identically in Finland, Japan, Chile, and Turkey. Suggests alternative explanation might be developmental differences in language acquisition. Discusses how school structures favor skills that develop earlier in girls, on average. Mentions that redshirting boys for kindergarten improves outcomes. Suggests this points to developmental rather than cultural cause. Brings up lack of male teachers in elementary education. Presents research on same-gender teacher effects. Discusses how education policy has not addressed boys' falling outcomes. Asks whether gender equality should concern itself with areas where males are falling behind. I say, feminism is about equality for everyone. He asks why major feminist organizations have opposed shared parenting legislation. Cites specific bills and organizational position statements. Asks why opposition to men's rights groups is so uniform if goals are truly egalitarian. I try to explain that men's rights groups are often misogynistic. He agrees some are. Asks whether concerns about fathers' rights, male homelessness, suicide rates, and education gaps are inherently misogynistic, or whether they are legitimate gender issues. I do not have a good answer. More audience questions come. Each one seems designed to highlight contradictions in my positions. Question about transgender athletes. I give standard inclusive position. Kid asks about fairness concerns for female athletes. Presents data on physiological advantages. Discusses high school track records. Swimming records. Mentions specific cases of records falling after transgender inclusion. Asks how I balance inclusion with fairness. I say fairness concerns are overstated and often a cover for bigotry. He presents Olympic qualifying standards, showing male times would win most female events. Asks if I think this represents zero competitive advantage. Discusses testosterone suppression studies showing strength retention. I argue this is fear-mongering about rare cases. He agrees cases are currently rare. Asks whether rarity makes fairness irrelevant. Points out that elite athletics is inherently about rare edge cases. Mentions that policy should address foreseeable scenarios. I am exhausted, have been intellectually on defense for 90 minutes straight. Every claim I make, he has counter-evidence. Every study I cite, he knows the methodology and limitations. Every argument I present, he has clearly encountered and prepared for. Final question is about quotas and affirmative action. I present case for correcting historical imbalances. Kid acknowledges historical discrimination, then asks about current implementation. Discusses mismatch theory in university admissions. Presents data on students admitted with lower qualifications having worse outcomes. Cites specific studies on STEM completion rates. Discusses how this might harm intended beneficiaries. Brings up Asian discrimination in university admissions. Presents data from Harvard case. Because asks whether discrimination is acceptable when it serves diversity goals. Discusses Supreme Court reasoning. I argue that diversity is a compelling interest. He asks whether diversity of thought is included in that interest. Points out that political diversity on campus is at historic low. Cites studies showing overwhelming ideological uniformity in social science departments. Asks whether I think this affects research quality and conclusions. Mentions Replication crisis in social psychology. Discusses specific failed replications of studies I have cited. I did not know several of my sources had failed replication. Moderator calls time. Debate is over. Closing statements. I give brief summary of my positions. Sound defensive, even to myself. Talk about importance of continued vigilance against discrimination. Mention structural inequalities and ongoing work needed. Kid gives his closing. Thanks me again for participating. Summarizes his main points calmly. Says evidence suggests biological factors and personal choices explain most gender outcome differences. States that misrepresenting data to support predetermined conclusions undermines credibility. Argues for evidence-based approach to real discrimination where it exists. Calls for addressing gender issues affecting both men and women. Ends by saying that disagreement is healthy and he hopes audience will investigate claims themselves. Provides list of sources he cited. Says he will post full bibliography online. Audience applauds. Much longer and more enthusiastic than my introduction received. Several students immediately crowd around him, asking questions. One asks where he learned all this. He says he has been reading academic papers and datasets for 2 years. Mentions that most sources are publicly available. Says anyone can verify what he presented. I stand awkwardly to the side. A few students thank me politely for participating. Can tell they are being diplomatic. One of my own students approaches. She looks uncomfortable. Asks if I knew about some of the studies he cited. I admit I did not. She says she is going to look them up. I can see the doubt in her face. Walk back to my office. Check my phone. Someone has already posted clips to social media. Comments are brutal. Professor gets destroyed by high schooler. When credentials meet actual knowledge. This is embarrassing for the university. Sit at my desk. Open my laptop. Start searching the studies he cited. Find the Cornell wage progression study. It says what he claimed. Find the Harvard bus driver study. It says what he claimed. Look up the CAH studies. The digit ratio research. The cross-cultural personality data. The replication failures. All real. All saying what he said they say. Realize I have been citing the same dozen studies for years. Never checked whether they had been challenged. Never looked at contrary evidence. Built entire career on framework I assumed was unassailable. Just got intellectually demolished by a teenager. In front of 200 people. Because he read more widely than I did. Because he checked primary sources. Because he did not assume his position was correct and work backward. Feel humiliated. Feel angry. Feel something else. Feel like maybe I should have been less confident. Maybe should have engaged with criticism rather than dismissing it. Maybe academic consensus in my field is not same as scientific evidence. Maybe I have been teaching students a narrative rather than teaching them to think. Sit in dark office. No, this will follow me. No, students will question everything I teach now. No colleagues will hear about this. The worst part, the absolute worst part, is that he was right. About most of it. About checking sources and following evidence. About not letting ideology determine conclusions. And I have no idea how to come back from this. Spent 15 years building authority. Lost it in 90 minutes. To a high school senior who simply read more carefully than I did.